The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History Magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History Magazine. Between 1882 and 1894, U.S. soldiers fired lead bullets by the ton at the Department of the Platte's target ranges, first located near Fort Omaha and later near Bellevue. In this episode, we learn of their story and how a system of target practice helped produce an army of marksmen. In this 2016 Nebraska History Magazine article, Uncle Sam's Sharpshooters, written by James E. Potter. Between 1882 and 1894, U.S. soldiers fired lead bullets by the ton into the butts of the Department of the Platte's target ranges, first located near Fort Omaha and later near Bellevue, some 10 miles southeast of the fort. Some of these missiles probably remained buried beneath the modern landscape. Physical evidence of the ranges themselves, like the clouds of black powder smoke that issued from the rifles of the soldiers who used them, have long since disappeared. Yet their story can be resurrected from the historical record to reveal how a system of target practice initiated in the last quarter of the 19th century helped produce an army of marksmen by the early years of the 20th. Throughout much of the 19th century, training soldiers to shoot with accuracy was low on the U.S. Army's list of priorities, even as it adopted new weapons capable of doing so. Civil War volunteers received little, if any, instruction beyond how to load and fire their guns as rapidly as possible. According to the tactics of the day, mass volleys from soldiers deployed in ranks were expected to decimate an enemy force by the sheer number of bullets sent in its direction. Taking time to aim at individual combatants would actually slow the rate of fire. Later, during the Plains Indian Wars, U.S. soldiers' deficiency in marksmanship became painfully evident during encounters with an elusive foe who fought individually or in small groups and often emerged unscathed by Army bullets. Not until the early 1880s, after the Indian Wars were nearly over, did the Army brass take significant steps to address these shortcomings. They realized that the future wars would be waged against foreign armies that were far more disciplined and better armed than the Plains tribes. In the postbellum years, Nebraska was within the Army's Department of the Platte, whose headquarters were in Omaha. In 1873, Department Commander Brigadier General Edward O.C. Ord took some of the earliest steps to train soldiers to become better shots. He ordered post and company officers to oversee weekly target practice at the department's various stations and published the results in the Army and Navy Journal, including the highest and lowest scores and the names of the respective company commanders. Another of his orders authorized post commanders to use lumber on hand to build target frames because, quote, recent campaigns against Indians have demonstrated that it is better to expend lumber for targets than for coffins, end quote. After being reassigned to command the Department of Texas, Ord continued to promote target practice and issued a grim but practical admonition. Quote, the soldier is armed so that he may, in battle, hurt somebody with his rifle, and the sooner he learns to do so, the better the soldier, end quote. During the remainder of the 1870s, the Army took halting steps toward developing a systematic marksmanship training program, spurred on by Indian Wars reverses demonstrating that the soldiers still remained ill-prepared to hurt somebody in battle. In 1876, the number of cartridges allocated to each soldier for monthly target practice was increased from 10 to 20. A new manual for rifle instruction was adopted in 1879, and the Army Ordnance Department was delegated to provide ammunition and standardized targets, the latter based on those used by the National Rifle Association. The Quartermaster's Department was made responsible for the funding to build and maintain rifle ranges. General Order 44, issued by Army Commander General William Tecumseh Sherman on May 10, 1881, completed the process of formalizing the Army's marksmanship training. The program would be underpinned by regular target practice held at individual military posts. Scores made during the target season would determine the competitors for an annual contest to select the 12 best marksmen in each of the Army's 9 administrative departments. The department teams would then compete in the division contest. There were 3 military divisions in 1882. At each stage, medals and badges would be awarded. The order also provided that the Army's commanding general would select the 12 best marksmen in the Army based on the reports from the departments and divisions for a head-to-head competition in alternate years beginning in 1882. The Springfield rifle, adopted in 1873, was the arm used in U.S. Army marksmanship training and competition by infantry soldiers until near the end of the 19th century. It was a single-shot breech loader that fired a .45 caliber lead bullet propelled by 70 grains of black powder, which produced significant recoil and a cloud of white smoke. Hence, the cartridge containing bullet, powder, and primer was designated the .45-70. Springfield cavalry carbines were the same design, though shorter and lighter for horseback use. The powder charge for its cartridge was reduced to 55 grains. Initially, the soldiers fired from intervals of 100 to 600 yards at circular targets developed by the National Rifle Association. A standing or offhand position was used at the shorter distances, kneeling for the mid-range targets, and prone or reclining positions for the targets at 600 yards. In each case, the men were firing at known distances. In skirmish firing, the soldiers both advanced and retreated and, on command, halted at various points from 500 to 200 yards distant to fire at a line of targets. This drill somewhat simulated combat and was designed to train the men to estimate how far it was to the object they sought to hit with the bullets they fired. In 1885, the circular target used at the fixed distances was replaced by one with elliptical rings that more nearly approximated the vital area of the body, while new skirmish targets simulated human silhouettes in standing, kneeling, or prone positions. In 1889, separate matches were added to the competitive program for cavalrymen primarily armed with carbines and revolvers. They performed similar skirmish drills, some of them from horseback. Fort Omaha faced particular challenges in providing marksmanship training for the soldiers stationed there. Established as Omaha Barracks in 1868 and located 3 miles north of Omaha, the fort's military reservation encompassed only 85.5 acres. By 1878, when the barracks was declared a permanent post and renamed Fort Omaha, the area to the south and west remained primarily agricultural, although several subdivisions had been platted to the east and southeast. The fort's proximity to civilian landholdings and its constricted military reservation made establishing a suitable target range problematic. Where Fort Omaha soldiers practiced marksmanship in 1881 is unknown, but 4 men from its garrison were on the 12-man Department of the Platte team that competed in the division of the Missouri matches at Fort Snelling, Minnesota that fall. By April of 1882, a new rifle range had been developed west of the fort and 18 picked men were practicing there. The matches to determine the Department of the Platte team for 1882 were held in early August with 34 competitors. Corporal H.W. Gordon of Company K, 9th Infantry, received the gold medal awarded to the team member with the highest score. No description of the range used for the 1882 Department of the Platte matches has ever been found, but apparently it left something to be desired, or perhaps its use by large numbers of riflemen sparked complaints from nearby landowners. Another range was built south of Fort Omaha for the 1883 target season, this too on land outside the military reservation leased from private properties. In June, an Omaha Daily Bee reporter visited the new Creedmoor near Fort Omaha and described it in a lengthy article. The range lay due south of the fort, was 150 feet wide and 800 yards long, and oriented slightly north of west on rising ground. 5 target frames were located at the butts, the impact area, on the west end, while 5 lines of white posts spanned the range parallel to the targets at intervals of 200, 300, 400, 500, and 600 yards to mark the firing points. Captain Charles A. Coolidge, 7th U.S. Infantry, the department's inspector of rifle practice, showed the reporter the target scoring trench, or pit, above which the targets were raised. A bank of earth had been thrown up in front of the 8-foot deep trench, behind which rose another embankment 15 feet high and 10 feet thick to catch bullets after they passed through the targets. Both the trench and the embankments were reinforced with planks. Each set of 2 targets was mounted on paper secured to 2 wooden frames. They revolved on an axle so that one target would be down in the pit when another was elevated for use. After each bullet struck the target, a soldier in the pit raised a pole topped with a colored disc showing the rifleman where the shot had landed in the score. Rotating the frame brought a fresh target into position, while the bullet hole in the previous target was being pasted up in the pit. A similar layout and scoring system would have been used at other Army target ranges during this era, including the future Bellevue Range. After visiting the target pit, the B man was invited to take a few shots with the Army rifle from 600 yards. After missing a 6 by 6 foot target 3 times and, quote, almost fracturing his shoulder from the recoil of the gun, end quote, the reporter gave up. The range south of Fort Omaha hosted the department matches in September 1883 and again in August of 1884. But its location on leased land, whose further development seemed only a matter of time, remained a concern. Shortly before the August 1884 competition was to begin, a civilian secured an injunction against the Army's use of the range, but withdrew it after, quote, having been offered a reasonable compensation for the security of life and limb, end quote. At the same time, Omaha residents had begun questioning whether Fort Robinson itself should be relocated to a more spacious site that, quote, would afford all the room wanted for rifle ranges, storehouses, and encampments, end quote. By February 1885, the Army and Navy Journal reported that Fort Sidney was being considered to host the Department of the Platte target range. Fort Sidney had space for an extended range and was closer to the railroad than Fort Omaha, which was, quote, 4 miles from the railroad depots and often difficult to access for teams arriving during the annual contests, end quote. Department Commander Brigadier General Oliver O. Howard, however, decided to seek a new lease for the existing range despite the, quote, grasping avarice of the farmers who own the land and who are asking triple prices to allow the government to use it, end quote. When that option fell through, Major Guy V. Henry, the department's recently designated inspector of rifle practice, soon leased a new site about 100 yards west of the fort. Though its relation to the site of the 1882 range is not known, it likely was a different location because here target practice could be extended up to 1,000 yards. Army headquarters in Washington, D.C. provided a $1,000 appropriation to cover the cost of construction. The 1885 department matches on the range west of Fort Omaha, which began on August 10th, had an added feature. At Major Henry's suggestion, Omaha citizens offered to donate prizes valued at $800 to supplement the usual medals and badges the Army provided. The donations included several gold watches, a set of Shakespeare's works, rugs, cigars, a carving set, a smoking jacket, and cash. A handsome water set provided by the Union Pacific Railroad and a bronze clock donated by the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad went to the winning regimental team and regimental skirmish team, respectively. After the prizes had been awarded, the officers hosted an evening party at the range attended by a crowd of Omaha citizens. An open pavilion had been constructed for dancing, with music provided by the 4th U.S. Infantry Band. Use of the 1885 range proved short-lived when the parties from whom Major Henry had leased it, quote, sold out their interests to real estate dealers, end quote. Resolution of the seemingly constant problem of maintaining a suitable rifle range near Fort Omaha finally came in 1886, when Henry found a site that, while not adjacent to the fort, would well serve Fort Omaha and the Department of the Platte for the next 9 years. It was on the plateau overlooking the Missouri River just north of Bellevue in Sarpy County and some 10 miles southeast of Fort Omaha. The Burlington and Missouri River rail line passed just below the bluff to the east. Most of the property belonged to Henry T. Clark, from whom the Army leased it. Henry and his subordinates wasted no time getting the range ready for summer target practice and the pending late summer department competition. Compared to former Fort Omaha ranges, the one near Bellevue was nearly ideal. Not only was it easily accessible via the B&M Railroad, enough land could be cleared for campsites and the firing range itself, while still leaving a surrounding belt of woodlands for shade and to break the wind. The area encompassing the target pit and firing stations was some 800 yards long and 500 yards wide, easily accommodating 8 shooters at fixed firing points and providing the required 600 yards for both known distance and skirmish firing. The target stood at the north end, ensuring that the sun would not be in the marksman's eyes at any time of the day. A grandstand for officials and spectators connected to the target pit by telephone was at the south end. In its technical aspects, the range conformed well to Army requirements. As the campsites signaled, its distance from Fort Omaha meant that soldiers who used it during practice sessions and official competitions would bivouac on site. Water was provided by a well. A bakehouse was built near the enlisted men's camp. In the summer of 1887, the railroad added a range depot or platform about 200 yards from the range itself where competitors and spectators could disembark. Supply wagons could reach the range via a mail road from Omaha that skirted it along the west and south. Just before the first Department of the Platte competition was set to begin on the new range, a severe storm threatened the hard work Major Henry and his men had put in getting it ready. Shortly after midnight on August 13th, 1886, which was Friday the 13th, quote, a tornado of wind, floods of water, and the most vivid lightning, end quote, blew down the 47 tents, swept rifles, carbines, and even a mule into the tops of trees and injured several men. The anonymous soldier journalist who reported the storm to the Army and Navy Journal joked that he and his comrades were now fully qualified to advise marksmen about, quote, points on the wind, end quote, at the Bellevue Range. The first Department of the Platte competition held at the Bellevue Range concluded on August 28, 1886. According to the Army's format, the competitors were selected on the basis of scores made during the summer target season at the various posts within the department. The highest scoring marksmen in each company plus the top 2 officers from each regiment as selected by the department commander were eligible for the annual contest to determine the 12 best marksmen. Several days of practice preceded the firing for record. Colonel Frank Wheaton presented the awards to the 12 winning competitors who would move on to the division contest in which in 1886 was held at Fort Leavenworth. Major Henry complimented the enlisted men who worked much of the summer preparing the site, whose reward, quote, is in the praise of those who admire your beautiful range, end quote. Not only did the Army's marksmanship activities at the Bellevue Range spark considerable press coverage, including reports of the scores being made, they also drew crowds of civilians. The availability of rail transportation to the range's very doorstep was no doubt a factor, as was its park-like setting where citizens could enjoy an outing. The opportunity to associate with uniformed young men who displayed admirable skill at their profession of arms gave the visits an added aura of romanticism. In fact, Major Henry had encouraged civilian interest in the Bellevue Range by helping to organize an Omaha Rifle Club, which was allowed to use a small range constructed adjacent to the Army range. The Citizens Club was, quote, composed of some of the leading men of Omaha, eminent lawyers, doctors, real estate men, railroad men, and merchants, end quote. Every Wednesday during the summer of 1887, a special car delivered the club members and the fair ones of Omaha accompanying them to the range. Those who did not wish to shoot could rest in the shade, visit the Army Rifle Camp, or stroll in the woods. The Bellevue Range's attractions proved particularly strong on August 23, 1887, when awards for the Department of the Platte matches were presented. Among the spectators were many of Omaha's leading citizens and their wives, as well as Nebraska U.S. Senator Charles Manderson. The range presented a captivating prospect with its combination of brilliant uniforms, snow-white tents, and a perfect greensward terminating in a dense wood. The 2nd U.S. Infantry Band from Fort Omaha played a few airs before the 79 competitors were assembled, and Colonel Henry Morrow, standing in for Department Commander Brigadier General George Crook, presented medals and praise to the top 12 marksmen. Afterwards, Major Henry and 40 soldiers demonstrated skirmish firing with volleys that, quote, awoke 100 echoes in the neighboring woods, end quote. The spectators then adjourned to a shady grove near the officers' camp for a picnic lunch, including palatable slices of watermelon. Before boarding a train back to Omaha, the civilians and military dignitaries posed for photographs. In the short time since its establishment, the Bellevue Range and the officers and enlisted men who ran it had earned an excellent reputation, which led to the range's selection to host both the Division of the Missouri and the Army-wide Distinguished Marksman competitions that followed the 1887 department matches. By the time the Department of the Platte competition concluded on August 23rd, several of the 48 division match competitors had already begun to arrive. One of them reported that the officers' mess was excellent, vegetables were plentiful, and, quote, excellent bread is made at the camp bakehouse, end quote. What's more, a camp canteen furnished beer at 5 cents a glass or 25 cents a bottle. After the Division of the Missouri match was finished, 12 soldiers from throughout the Army competed at the Bellevue Range in the first biennial Distinguished Marksman competition from September 19th to September 22nd. Also attending was Colonel Stanhope E. Blunt, the Army's Inspector General of Rifle Practice, who had developed the marksmanship manual adopted in 1885. Blunt was impressed with Bellevue and thought, quote, it was the best range for matches in the country, as it is entirely separated from outside influences, end quote. General Crook presented the first place Distinguished Marksman Gold Medal to a Department of the Platte soldier, Sergeant E.A. Stevens. Soldiers from the departments of Texas and Dakota received silver medals for 2nd and 3rd place. Large details of officers and enlisted men were needed to run these competitions. Henry, the Department of Platte's Inspector of Rifle Practice from 1885 to 1889, later renamed Inspector of Small Arms Practice, was in charge, aided by another officer appointed as Rifle Camp Commander. Camp medical officers and adjutants were also designated. Officers from regiments at posts other than Fort Omaha were detailed to Bellevue as range officers and statisticians to ensure impartiality in scoring and record keeping. Enlisted men were assigned as cooks and mess stewards, carpenters, teamsters, clerks, and target markers. During the 1887 Department of the Platte competition, 90 enlisted men were detailed to work at the camp and the range. By contrast with the Army's parsimonious 10 rounds per month allowance to each soldier for target practice during the early 1870s, an enormous quantity of ammunition was expended in practice and competition during the 1880s. While no information is readily available on how many rounds may have been fired during practice sessions that were a regular feature at the various military posts, the figures for the 1887 matches at Bellevue are indicative. Over 7 days, including preliminary practice and firing for record in the Department of the Platte competition, 79 competitors fired some 34,000 cartridges, according to a report by the range's acting ordnance officer to the Division of the Missouri's Inspector of Rifle Practice. At the subsequent division competition, 53 men used some 29,000 cartridges over 9 days. Although the 19th century Army was segregated, soldiers from the African American cavalry and infantry regiments were eligible for the marksmanship competition, including those held at Bellevue. Corporal Beeman Walker, Company A, 9th U.S. Cavalry, stationed at Fort Niobrara, earned a place on the Department of the Platte rifle team in 1887. Other representatives of the black regiments included Sergeant Frank F. Jackson from Company G, 9th Cavalry at Fort Robinson, who garnered recognition as a distinguished marksman in 1889, 1890, 1892, 1893, and in 1894. William Mason, a private in Company B of the 9th at Fort Duchesne, Utah, when he first shot at Bellevue, later transferred to the 10th Cavalry, where he continued to rank high in carbine and revolver competitions. Spencer Thomas, a private in Company A, 9th Cavalry at Fort Robinson, became the 8th ranked marksman at the Bellevue competition in 1890. After promotion to corporal and transfer to Company H of the 9th, Thomas ranked number 2 on the Army Carbine team in 1894. As late as 1905, he was still making scores, qualifying him as a distinguished marksman. In 1891, the Secretary of War authorized one troop in each of several regular Army cavalry regiments to be composed entirely of Indians commanded by white officers. Unlike the Indian auxiliaries the Army had previously employed for short-term service, these men were enlisted for 5 years, issued standard uniforms and arms, and trained as other soldiers. Troop L of the 6th Cavalry at Fort Niobrara enlisted Brule men from the nearby Rosebud Reservation. Although regulations barred the Indian soldiers from participating in the Army marksmanship matches, Sergeant Fast Dog of Troop L, who had apparently demonstrated skill on the Fort Niobrara range, was mistakenly ordered to Bellevue for the 1893 cavalry competition. Once he was there, Department of the Platte Commander Brigadier General John R. Brooke allowed him, quote, to take the prescribed course of firing along with competitors regularly detailed, end quote. Fast Dog placed 21st out of 37 shooters with a carbine and 2nd with a revolver. When these astonishing scores became known, the officers at the range clubbed together to purchase a non-military medal for Fast Dog. In presenting it, General Brooke remarked, quote, I want you to wear this medal as a symbol of what the Indian can do under proper surroundings. Let it be a talisman of priceless value because you have won it against white and colored alike. I deeply regret that you could not have been permitted to wear a medal made by the nation, end quote. No such episode would happen again, however, because the Army ended its experiment with enlisted Indian soldiers in 1894. For most of the competitors at Bellevue, their accomplishments as marksmen may have been the pinnacle of their military careers. That was not the case with 2nd Lieutenant John J. Pershing of the 6th U.S. Cavalry stationed at Fort Niobrara in 1891. At the Platte, East, and California Tri-Department Cavalry competition at Bellevue that August, Pershing earned 5th place on the carbine team and 2nd place on the revolver team. That same month, the Army detailed him as Commandant of Cadets at the University of Nebraska, a post he held until 1895. His leadership of troops while campaigning against Moro tribesmen in the Philippines during the early 1900s led to his rapid rise through the ranks, culminating with his appointment to command the American Expeditionary Forces in France during World War I. The 1894 Department of the Platte Rifle Competition and the Tri-Department Cavalry Competition was held as usual at the Bellevue Range. Again, a crowd came from Omaha by train on September 25th to witness the presentation of awards by General Brooke. Sergeant Robert Wilson of the 17th U.S. Infantry at Fort D.A. Russell in Wyoming was the top rifle shooter with a record score of 350 out of 400 possible points at the known distance targets. All the competitors used the Springfield rifle or carbine that had been the Army's staple since 1873. Once the award ceremony was over, Lieutenant Henry Lyon, also an accomplished marksman, demonstrated the new Krag-Jorgensen bolt-action repeating rifle, which the Army had selected to replace the Springfield. Even amateurs could distinguish the Krag-Jorgensen rifle's sharper report and the limited smoke from its discharge by comparison with that of the Springfield's black powder cartridge. Most spectators probably did not realize that the appearance of the Krag-Jorgensen, along with the pending completion of nearby Fort Crook, signaled the end of the Bellevue Range. Developments that brought this result had been underway for several years. First was the July 23, 1888 approval of Senator Charles Manderson's bill to build a new and larger military post in the vicinity to replace Fort Omaha. In February 1890, the government bought 545 acres for this purpose southwest of the village of Bellevue. By March 1891, Congress had appropriated some $700,000 for the new post's construction and renamed it Fort Crook in honor of the Department of the Platte's recently deceased former commander, George Crook. Once Fort Crook was completed and occupied, it was expected that a target range would be constructed somewhere within its military reservation. The second development was the Army's adoption of the Krag-Jorgensen as its new rifle and carbine, an arm tested and authorized between 1890 and 1893. Production began at the government armories in January 1894. It was May 1895 before all the Army's infantry regiments had been issued the Krag rifle. It took until September before the carbine's distribution to the cavalry was complete. Providing the required ammunition, completely new both as to caliber and its use of smokeless powder, also took time. In January 1895, the Army suspended regular target practice until all units had received the Krag. When practice resumed that summer, the brass realized that the competitive program should also be suspended until the soldiers had been given enough time to use the new arm and learn its capabilities. Accordingly, no departmental or Army-wide marksmanship competition was held in 1895 and 1896. With completion suspended and Fort Crook nearing completion, the Bellevue Range now seems superfluous, and the annual appropriation to lease it, $600 in 1891, for example, could be saved. Although troops would not occupy Fort Crook until June 1896, a rifle range was laid out there in early spring in 1895, and so the Fort Omaha soldiers could begin practicing with the new rifle. Firing began on May 20th. A few days later, a local farmer living in rear of the target butts asked to meet at the range with Department Commander Brigadier General James J. Coppinger. The farmer arrived, quote, with his pockets full of steel-cased bullets, which he had picked up about and beyond his dwelling, end quote. While the butts were as high as those in the Bellevue Range, the Krag's rifle's flatter trajectory and higher velocity sent many bullets ricocheting over the backstop for a mile or more, quote, like skipping stones on a pond, end quote. Coppinger immediately suspended use of the range so terraces could be built to stop the bullets. Unfortunately, the terraces did not solve the problem, and the Fort Crook range could not be used with safety. Faced with this reality and needing to give the Fort Omaha soldiers an opportunity to practice with the Krag-Jorgensen rifle, the officers came up with a solution that also provided the men with practice marches. In August and September 1895, portions of the Fort Omaha garrison marched to the Omaha Indian Reservation in Thurston County, where firing practice was held on a site provided by the Omaha Indian Agent. Soldiers actually moved into Fort Crook in June 1896, but they continued to go to the Omaha Reservation in lieu of taking target practice at the fort. By early 1897, Lieutenant Grote Hutchinson of the 9th U.S. Cavalry, Department of the Platte Inspector of Small Arms Practice, lamented the lack of a usable range at Fort Crook. Quote, "The command at Fort Crook is and will be greatly embarrassed in building up its efficiency until a suitable range, convenient for use, is near at hand. At present, this command is compelled to go nearly 100 miles to conduct its target practice at the Indian Reservation, which then occurs in connection with the annual practice march and field exercises," end quote. Efforts to establish a range at Fort Crook that was safe for at least limited use continued because the Omaha Bee in July 1897 noted that practice was again being held and more terraces or backstops were being built. This range may not have been at the same location at Fort Crook's first range in 1895, but it is clear that it still fell short of expectations. After a 2-year hiatus, Department Infantry and Cavalry Marksmanship competition was held in 1897. Because the Fort Crook Range would not serve, even though Department of the Platte headquarters remained in Omaha, the cavalry matches were held at Fort Robinson, September 24th and 27th, and the infantry matches at Fort Niobrara, October 4th through the 9th. All department and Army-wide matches were again suspended from 1898 through 1901 due to the war with Spain and the subsequent fighting with Philippine nationalists in those islands. Not until 1903 did the Army's competitive marksmanship program fully resume. In the meantime, another attempt to use the Fort Crook Range in June 1900 resulted in a farmer's horse being struck by a stray bullet. In June 1901, the Department of the Missouri authorized Fort Crook's commanding officer to close the range. As late as 1904, the soldiers at Fort Crook were still going to the Omaha Reservation for target practice. By then, it had been 10 years since the Bellevue Range, in its garb of green, last attracted the Flower of Omaha to observe, quote, the relentless possibilities of war that go on there, end quote. Notwithstanding the romantic hyperbole by which an Omaha Bee reporter once described the Bellevue Range, it had served a serious purpose and contributed much to the improvement of U.S. Army marksmanship during the 1880s and 1890s. Being in rifle camp at Bellevue likely was a pleasant respite from the hundreds of soldiers competing there. In hindsight, had the Army kept control of the Bellevue Range until the Fort Crook Range's shortcomings had become apparent, the former might have continued to serve the Department of the Platte's needs for years to come, even with the Army's new high-velocity rifle. The landscape beyond the range's impact area was heavily wooded and unsuited for agriculture, unlike the area surrounding Fort Crook, which sparked problems with its target range from the beginning. The decision to abandon the Bellevue Range must have seemed the right one under the circumstances in view at the time. Once those circumstances changed, the decision apparently could not be reversed. Nevertheless, during its 9 years of use, the Bellevue Rifle Range was a critical component of Nebraska's military infrastructure that also attracted attention to and support for the Army's mission from the civilian community. Most important, the range provided opportunity for both officers and enlisted men to learn, demonstrate, and be rewarded for their proficiency at one of the basic skills required to be a soldier. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcast episodes, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of the Nebraska State Historical Society, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and get notified when we release new episodes on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.